There's a quiet dread to the town of Salty Cove, a place forgotten by time and progress. The sea air here tastes of salt and decay, clinging to the clapboard houses and the worn faces of its inhabitants. It's a town where people stay, not because they want to, but because they have to, a tether to generations of fishermen and their ancient, unspoken pacts with the water. For the Hayes family, this legacy is all they've ever known. Robert, with his salt and pepper beard and the perpetual, weary stoop of a man who's seen too much, carries the weight of it all. He's a fisherman, like his father and his father before him. But the sea has given him little joy and much sorrow. He drinks not for pleasure, but for oblivion, to silence the whispers of the waves and the old stories he's tried so hard to forget. He'll sit for hours on the porch, staring out at the hazy horizon, a deep-seated fear etched into his eyes. A fear that has nothing to do with storms. When his wife, Sarah, asks about the ragged scar on his shoulder, a mark she's never seen him flinch at, he'll only say it was an old accident, a boyish mistake. Sarah, on the other hand, is the anchor. She's all practicality and common sense, a woman who puts her faith in what she can see and touch. The worn wood of their boat, the solid ground beneath her feet, the two children she works so hard to protect. She finds her husband's quiet, distant melancholy frustrating, a weakness she can't understand. She believes in hard work, not in the ghost stories that seem to hang in the air of Salty Cove. Their daughter, Lily, a quiet, observant girl, is much like her mother, but their son Jacob is different. He's a strange, ethereal boy with a fascination for the unseen. While his sister would play in the dirt, Jacob would be on the beach, drawing pictures in the sand. Bizarre, sprawling images of creatures with too many limbs, of long, twisting tentacles that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. His father would watch him with a silent, pained expression. Today, the family prepares for a simple hike to the tidal flats, a place where the murky river meets the vast, dark ocean. It's a boundary point, a place of transition. The old-timers in town have always called it the Exchange, a spot that doesn't belong to the land or the sea, but to something in between. One old fisherman, his voice raspy with age and secrets, whispers to Sarah as they pass, "Be careful at the Exchange. It's where old souls find new bodies." The words send a shiver down Sarah's spine, a brief prickle of fear that she quickly dismisses as nonsense. The air grows heavy and still as they approach the water's edge, a humid, expectant silence that presses in on them from all sides. The tidal flats are shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog, the river's current barely visible as it churns black against the gray sand. The water here is not clear or blue, but a soupy, opaque darkness, a void that seems to swallow light. As they walk, Jacob trips on a hidden root, tumbling toward the churning, dark water. Sarah instinctively reaches out, but she's a second too late. Robert, with a speed that belies his weary frame, lunges into the current, his body swallowed by the darkness. He disappears without a trace, leaving a ripple that quickly fades. Sarah screams his name, but the only sound is the ceaseless churning of the water. For a moment, all is still, save for the frantic pounding of her own heart. Then, the water begins to stir again, and a small figure emerges. It's Jacob, scrambling back to the shore, soaking wet and gasping for air. Sarah rushes to him, a wave of relief washing over her, but as her hands reach for his little body, they instinctively pull back. There's a strange, cold heat emanating from him, and as she touches his wet skin, a searing pain, like fire, shoots through her fingertips. A gasp escapes her lips, and she looks at her son, truly looks at him. And for the first time, she feels an icy, bone-deep terror. This is her son, but something is wrong, terribly wrong. The boy looks back at her with eyes that are not his, and a calm, vacant expression that fills her with an all-encompassing dread. The river has returned her son, But at what cost? And where, oh where is her husband? Panic, a single, sharp, excruciating note of it pierces the silent dread. Sarah's scream is a raw, animal sound that tears from her throat, a desperate question thrown at the empty air. Where is he? Where is Robert? The answer is a chilling silence, the river's only reply being the soft lapping of water against the shore. Her daughter, Lily, frozen on the bank, stares in horror at the spot where her father vanished. She, too, is a statue of terror. Unable to move or speak, her tiny world shattered in a heartbeat. Sarah, on the other hand, is propelled by a frantic, primal energy. She clutches Jacob's small, clammy hand, the burning pain a dull throb now, a secondary concern to the overwhelming terror consuming her. She pulls him close, as if to confirm his presence, to anchor herself in the reality that at least one of them has returned. But the vacant look in his eyes, the unsettling stillness of his body, does little to calm her. The minutes stretch into an eternity of screaming, of desperate calls into the oppressive fog. Sarah runs up and down the riverbank, her bare feet slipping on the slick mud, her voice growing hoarse with each useless cry. The thick, unnatural fog seems to press in on her, a physical manifestation of her fear. It's as if the world itself is conspiring against her, holding its breath in anticipation of a tragedy that has already occurred. The cold, impenetrable darkness of the water offers no answers, only a cold, silent tomb. Where is her husband, the man who promised to protect them, who had vowed to always return from the sea? He is gone, just like that, a whisper in the current, a shadow in the depths, as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting the tidal flats in a sinister, purplish light. The rest of the family arrives. They, too, are frantic, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. A small group of fishermen, their faces etched with the kind of grim knowledge that only comes from a life spent on the sea, join the search. They cast their nets, their faces hardened, their movements silent and swift. But the river yields nothing. A single lantern is all they have, its feeble light swallowed by the thick fog, the beam a futile attempt to pierce the darkness. They search for hours, calling his name, their voices swallowed by the endless, rhythmic churning of the water. But no one answers. Sarah watches them from the shore, her heart a hollow, throbbing thing in her chest. She is a woman on the edge of a chasm, looking into an abyss that has swallowed the man she loved. The truth is a quiet, brutal thing. It settles over the town like a shroud, a heavy, unspoken burden. Robert is gone, vanished. The river has taken him, and it will not give him back. The small town talk turns into hushed whispers, the same old stories she's always dismissed, now taking on a horrifying new meaning. Was it a rogue current? A sudden cramp? The seasoned fishermen shake their heads, their faces grim. There's something else at play here, something old and hungry. Sarah, in her silent, suffocating grief, feels an emptiness so profound it threatens to consume her. She has lost the man she loves, the anchor of her family, and now she is left with a boy who is both her son and a complete stranger. She feels a terrible, bone-deep certainty that this is not an accident, that there is something malevolent in the river, and it has taken one life and left her another. The question no longer is what happened to Robert, but who or what has returned in his place. The boy who returned was not the boy who had left. Jacob was silent now, his childish chatter replaced by a chilling stillness. His eyes, once bright with the mischief of a 6-year-old, were now a hollow, empty gray, like pebbles at the bottom of a riverbed. He ate nothing, and when Sarah tried to offer him a glass of milk, he refused, his small hand pushing it away. All he would accept was water, and even then, he drank it with a strange, gulping eagerness that unsettled her to her core. Sarah, in her frantic grief, tried to hold him, to find some shred of the son she had lost. But the moment her arms encircled him, a searing pain shot up her forearms. It was a burn, sharp and fiery, as if she were holding hot metal, and she recoiled, Clutching her hands to her chest, she hid the marks under long sleeves, a secret shame she couldn't explain. Her daughter, Lily, saw none of this. To her, Jacob was just quiet, a little shaken from the accident. She would bring him toys, speak to him in a soft, reassuring voice, and he would nod or give a small, placid smile. But to Sarah, every movement he made felt alien, every silence a chasm of terror. She saw how his head would turn, as if listening to something only he could hear. She saw how his fingers, once pudgy and soft, now felt strangely cold and slick to the touch, like river stones. Her mind, a fortress of logic and reason, was under siege. It tried to explain the unexplainable, the burn, the hollow eyes, the unnerving silence. It was grief, it was shock, it was a mother's overactive imagination, but deep in her heart, a primal animal fear told her that this was not her son. This was something else. Driven by a desperation that bordered on madness, Sarah sought help. She took Jacob to the town doctor, a kind old man who had delivered both as her children. He examined the boy, checked his reflexes, and listened to his heart. "He's in shock, Sarah," the doctor said, his voice gentle. "He's seen something terrible. He just needs time to heal." The words were a balm, but they didn't touch the wound in her soul. She left with a prescription for sedatives for herself, a diagnosis of anxiety, and the unspoken pity of a man who believed she was losing her mind. But she knew. She felt it in the empty weight of Jacob's hand in hers, in the coldness that seeped into her bones. That night, a soft, rhythmic scratching sound from Jacob's room woke her. It was the sound of something tapping, tapping, tapping. Sarah crept to his door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her ear to the wood, the sound now clear and unmistakable. She slowly, fearfully, pushed the door open. Jacob was not in his bed. He was standing by the window, his back to her, and he was tapping a steady beat on the glass. He was whispering, but the words were not a language she recognized. It was a guttural, wet sound, a series of clicks and soft gurgles, like water bubbling up from a hidden spring. He was talking to something out there, in the impenetrable darkness. And Sarah, clutching her trembling hands to her chest, knew with a terrible, icy certainty that whatever had returned to her was not her son, and it was still connected to the darkness that had taken her husband. The whispers began almost immediately, not of her husband's death, for that was a tragedy they all understood, but of her son's peculiar, silent presence. Sarah felt the cold, judging stares of her neighbors, their silent questions as sharp as shards of glass. She was a pariah in her own town, a woman with a child who was not quite right, and a husband who had simply ceased to be. In her desperation, she began to seek answers where she could find them, in the town's history, in the old, musty books of its tiny library. The librarian, a woman with a kind face and guarded eyes, pretended to be busy as Sarah pored over old journals and fishermen's logs. Sarah soon realized why. The town's past was filled with stories of strange disappearances, of boats that returned empty, and of children who came back from the water changed. She found them hidden in the margins of ledgers, in the faded ink of forgotten diaries, stories of changeling creatures living in the tidal flats, a place the locals called the Exchange. The books described them as water spirits, beings that could shed their forms and take on the likeness of humans. They were said to be drawn to grief and loss, to places where the line between worlds was thin. One entry, from a diary dated 1888, was particularly chilling. It spoke of a young boy who was lost to the water, only to return with the same hollow eyes and strange stillness as her Jacob. The entry ended with the words, "The boy is here, but his soul is not." The more Sarah read, the more the cold knot of fear in her stomach tightened. These were not just fairy tales, they were warnings. She saw now why the town had been so tight-lipped. They knew. They all knew. As the days bled into weeks, Jacob's odd behaviors intensified. He no longer drew with crayons, but with the wet sand he brought in from the beach, his small, nimble fingers shaping grotesque, tentacled creatures. He still refused to eat, surviving on water alone. His body, once warm and soft, felt increasingly cold to the touch, and when she tried to check his forehead for a fever, a jolt of fire shot through her fingers. The burns were growing worse, a physical manifestation of the chasm between them. Sarah felt an immense, crippling loneliness. Her daughter, Lily, saw her mother's increasing paranoia, but she could not understand it. She still loved her brother, and Sarah's fear and revulsion felt like a betrayal. "Why are you so scared of him, Mama?" Lily would ask, her innocent eyes filled with hurt. And Sarah, unable to answer, would simply pull away, her heart aching with the terrible truth. In a last-ditch effort, Sarah went to see old Silas, a wizened fisherman who lived alone in a small shack on the edge of town. He was known for his stories, his knowledge of the sea and its secrets. When she asked him about the tidal flats, his face, weathered by a lifetime of sun and salt, went pale. "Some things are better left alone, Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The water takes when it wants, and sometimes it gives something back, but it's never for free." He looked at her with a profound pity. "Your husband, he came to me, years ago. He was a different man back then, scared. He asked me about the old stories, about a deal. He was trying to pay a debt he had with the water." Just as Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding with a desperate hope for more answers, the door of the shack swung open. A younger fisherman, Silas's son, stood in the doorway, his eyes narrow and suspicious. "Pa," he said, his voice sharp, "leave the past be. You know what they say." He shot a pointed glance at Sarah, his eyes filled with a warning. Silas's gaze dropped, and he fell silent. The opportunity for a full explanation, for the key to the entire mystery, was snatched away just as she was on the cusp of it. A terrible, agonizing silence filled the shack, leaving Sarah with only two words echoing in her mind: a deal, a debt. What kind of a deal? What kind of a debt? And what did it have to do with her husband's disappearance and the unsettling return of her son? The town's silent disapproval was a suffocating weight. Sarah felt it with every step, every glance. Their pity was a cloak of judgment, a passive condemnation for her inability to accept her grief and the strange, silent boy who was not her son. But she could not stop. The burning on her hands, the hollow look in Jacob's eyes, the memory of her husband's terrified face, they were a constant physical reminder that this was not over. The words of old Silas, a deal, a debt, echoed in her mind, a haunting refrain that drove her. She knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that the key to everything lay not in the future, but in the past. It lay with the man she thought she knew, and the secrets he had buried. The old Hayes house stood on the cliffs overlooking the treacherous water, a silent, weathered monument to generations of fishermen. Sarah felt a deep unease as she pushed open the creaking door. The house smelled of dust, salt, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of damp earth and decay. It was Robert's childhood home, a place he rarely spoke of. She began her search in his old bedroom, a small, cramped space with a single, unmade bed and a desk covered in a thick layer of dust. The room was a museum of a life unlived, a boy's world frozen in time. She found nothing of note until her gaze fell upon a loose floorboard beneath the bed. She pried it open with a trembling hand. Her heart hammering in her chest, beneath the board was a small, worn box, and inside it, a journal. It was old, its pages yellowed and brittle with age, the ink faded and smudged in places. She recognized her husband's hurried scrawl. Most of the entries were mundane, but as she flipped through the pages, her eyes caught on an entry dated 20 years ago. It described a storm, a fishing boat caught in a violent squall, and the moment when Robert was thrown overboard. He had recounted the terror of the churning water, the silent, certain knowledge that he was going to die. And then he wrote of a hand reaching out from the depths, a cold, long-fingered hand that pulled him to the surface. It was not a man, he wrote, but something else, a creature of the water, a giver of life and a taker of debt. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the pages. She found a separate, smaller notebook, tucked within the journal's back pocket, one she hadn't noticed at first glance. This one was even more peculiar. The entries were not in Robert's handwriting, but in a precise, spidery script, and they were filled with strange symbols and drawings. On the first page was a drawing of a monstrous, tentacled creature with a small human figure standing before it, a hand outstretched. The entry beside it read, "The water spirit. It does not kill. It simply trades." The pages that followed detailed the terms of a family pact, a life given for a life saved. The spirit would keep a person from death, but in return, it would one day claim a member of the family to balance the scales. The journal was an ancestral record, passed down from generation to generation, and it was filled with the names of those who had been saved and those who had been lost. A cold, dawning horror settled over Sarah. The scar on Robert's shoulder, the one he had always dismissed as a childhood accident, was drawn on one of the pages, a perfect match to a specific symbol. It was a mark of ownership, a brand. He had not survived by luck. He had been chosen. He had made a deal with the devil or something far worse, and now the debt had come due. But there was another entry, from her husband's own journal, one that was filled with a desperate plea. He had written of a terrible dream, of the creature's cold, dead eyes, of a voice that promised to take the strongest among them. He had jumped into the river not to save his son, but to take his place, to fulfill the debt himself. But something had gone wrong. The water had taken him, but it had sent back the boy, not as a changeling, but as a host, as a vessel for the debt that refused to be paid. She looked at the last entry of the journal, her husband's frantic, messy scrawl. "It is coming for him, the boy. It doesn't want me anymore. It wants the purity, the innocence. It is coming for my son." The words were in desperate warning, a final confession. Sarah's world, once a fortress of reason, had crumbled into a terrifying, unholy truth. The father was not a hero, but a victim. The son was not an imposter, but a target. And she, in her ignorance, had been a pawn in a game she hadn't known she was playing. A cold, determined rage, as potent as the sea itself, began to burn within her. She would not let this creature win. She would fight for her son, and she would find a way to pay the debt herself. The journal's pages, filled with a desperate truth, burned in Sarah's hands. The fear and revulsion she had felt for her husband morphed into a complicated, agonizing cocktail of grief and pity. He was not the villain she had imagined, a man who had sacrificed his child for wealth. He was a man drowning in a debt he had never agreed to pay, a debt that had been passed down through generations. He had been a victim long before the river claimed him. The man she had known, the quiet, haunted fisherman who drank to forget, was just the last, tormented chapter of a terrible family story. Armed with this newfound understanding, Sarah returned home, her gaze now fixed on her son, not with fear, but with a terrible, fierce empathy. She approached him in the living room, where he sat motionless on the floor, tracing patterns on the rug. The burning sensation in her hands was a distant memory, replaced by a cold certainty. She held up the journal, its worn cover a testament to the secrets it held. "I know," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I know what happened." She spoke not to the boy, but to the thing that inhabited him, a presence she now understood was as much a prisoner as her husband had been. "You're not here to hurt us," she said, her voice stronger now. "You're here to collect." The boy's head snapped up. For the first time, a flicker of something other than emptiness crossed his eyes. He did not speak, but he pointed a cold, wet finger toward the mantelpiece. Sarah followed his gaze, her heart pounding. Tucked behind an old family photo was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was not her husband's, but that of his best friend, a man named Thomas, who had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. Sarah had always assumed he had simply moved away. Now a cold dread crept up her spine as she realized the truth. He, too, was a victim of the family's curse. The notebook, written in a shaky, panicked scrawl, was a record of Robert's frantic attempts to sever his connection to the water. Thomas had been his only confidant, a man who had tried to help him fight a battle he could not win. The entries chronicled a series of failed rituals, of desperate prayers and sacrifices, all in an attempt to appease the water spirit. "He's trying to pay the debt himself," an entry read, "but it won't take him. It wants a pure soul, an innocent one, a life unburdened by its touch." Thomas, consumed by guilt and fear, had written of a final, desperate plan to try to find a way to sever the tie between Robert's family and the water spirit once and for all. But the entries abruptly stopped, a final, chilling note explaining that the water spirit had come for Thomas instead. He had sacrificed himself to save his friend, but it had not worked. The debt had simply been transferred to another member of the family. A new realization, as brutal as it was painful, washed over Sarah. Her husband's silence, his constant fear, it wasn't just about his own debt. It was about her. He had jumped into the water not just to save his son, but to protect her. The water spirit, in its twisted logic, would not take a soul that was already tainted by its touch. It wanted a clean slate, a pure soul. It wanted Jacob. Her husband's last act of love was an act of terrible, desperate self-sacrifice, an attempt to become the host himself, to keep the debt from reaching his son. But it was a sacrifice in vain. The water spirit, in its terrible, merciless hunger, had found a way to take its claim. It had possessed the boy, and it had left her with a choice. A terrible, impossible choice. How do you fight a thing you cannot touch? How do you save a soul that is already gone? These were the questions that haunted Sarah, as the grim reality settled over her. Her hands still burned, a constant physical reminder of the barrier between her and the thing that wore her son's face. The journal pages were her only compass, the faded ink her only hope. She had to learn the rules of this terrifying game, to understand the creature that had taken her husband and now held her son captive. She couldn't fight it, not with fists or words. She had to communicate. Her first attempts were clumsy, born of desperation. She would show the boy drawings of her husband, his face etched with a desperate hope. The creature would react with a subtle jerk of the head, a slight shift of its unblinking eyes. It was a language of nuance, of quiet, almost imperceptible signals. She soon learned that it understood her. It was not a mindless puppet. It was a thinking, sentient being, bound to her son's form. Sarah's breakthrough came when she showed the boy a drawing of the tidal flats. The creature's blank expression shifted, its fingers tapping a frantic, urgent rhythm on the paper. It was a pattern, a code she didn't understand. She gave him crayons, but he threw them to the floor, his frustration a silent, potent force. He wanted to use the same wet sand he had used before, the medium of the water. With trembling hands, Sarah filled a bowl with sand and water from the beach. The boy's fingers moved with a terrifying grace, shaping a map on the floor. It was a crude but unmistakable rendering of the coastline, with a specific, marked spot, a cave, hidden at the base of the cliffs, just beyond the tidal flats. This was it. The key. Sarah understood now. The creature wanted to go back. But why? Was it a trap? A terrifying part of her mind screamed at her to run, to leave this thing behind. But the look in its eyes, a flicker of an emotion she couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Desperation? Convinced her to try. She knew she couldn't take him in the car. The creature's strange presence made the engine sputter and die. She would have to walk. The journey was a slow, agonizing one. Every step felt like a betrayal of the life she once had. As she and the boy walked, the townspeople of Salty Cove watched from their windows, their faces filled with judgment. They saw a woman losing her mind, dragging her terrified son towards the dangerous sea. They didn't see the silent communication between them, the strange, cooperative journey towards a shared, terrifying goal. Sarah's hands, still burning, felt the cold touch of the boy's hand in hers, a link she could not sever. She realized that the water spirit didn't want the boy to leave. It wanted to keep him. The debt, it seemed, was not a simple one-for-one exchange. It was a claim, a binding of souls to the water forever. The creature was trying to get free, to return to the sea, to fulfill its part of the bargain. But the spirit, the master of the exchange, was holding it captive, refusing to let it go. As they neared the cliffs, a dark storm began to gather on the horizon. The air crackled with tension, the wind howled with a mournful, hungry sound. The water below them churned with a terrible, frothing energy. It was a warning, a final, powerful voice telling her to stop. She was a trespasser in a place she didn't belong, playing a game with rules she didn't understand. The path ahead was dark, treacherous, and full of secrets she was only just beginning to uncover. The journey was not just to a cave on a cliff. It was into the heart of a mystery that had swallowed her husband whole and was now coming for her son. The question now was, what would she find at the end of this dark and perilous road? The rising storm was a symphony of chaos, a fitting soundtrack for the turmoil raging inside Sarah. She was a woman on a desperate mission, a mother driven by a fierce, protective love for a child she could not recognize and a husband she now understood. The map that the creature had drawn was her only guide, a cryptic key to a secret place she hoped would hold the answers she so desperately sought. She was no longer just running from fear. She was running towards a truth she was beginning to piece together, a truth that promised to be as devastating as it was liberating. As she packed a small bag with ropes, a flashlight, and a few bottles of water, her hand brushed against the pocket of her husband's old fishing jacket, still hanging by the door. She had worn it on cold nights, finding a strange comfort in its worn fabric and the lingering scent of salt and him. Her fingers closed around a small hard object. It was a small leather-bound notebook, one she had never seen before. This one was different. It had no entries, no dates, only a single page with a drawing of a man with a large X on his chest and a name written underneath: Robert Hayes. Under the drawing was a short, terse note. The debt is not paid. The debt is transferred. A cold, dawning horror washed over Sarah. Her husband's suicide, his final act of defiance, it was a futile one. He had not sacrificed himself to save his son. He had sacrificed himself to transfer the debt to another, to himself. He had become the new host. The creature was not an imposter. It was a part of her husband's soul, a piece of him that had been given to the water in exchange for his son's life. As she stood there, trembling, the boy, the imposter, walked to her side. He took her hand, and the familiar burning sensation was gone. A cold, reassuring touch replaced it. He pointed to the jacket, and then to himself. He drew a quick picture in the air of a man falling into the water and a boy being pushed out. He was trying to tell her that the one she thought was a monster was a prisoner, bound to her son's form, but it was not her son. It was her husband, or what was left of him. He had given his soul to the water, and now it was a part of her son, a kind of ghost that lived within his body. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had been so consumed by her own fear and grief that she had failed to see the truth. The creature was not evil. It was a part of her husband, a desperate plea for help. He had tried to become the debt, to save his son, but the water spirit, in its twisted logic, had found a way to take its claim. It had possessed the boy, and it was using him as a vessel to get to the man who was meant to be the new host. The boy, the impostor, took her hand and led her to a small rowboat. He gestured towards the water, his eyes filled with a new, frantic urgency. He wanted her to go to the cave, to the place on the map. He wanted her to save the man she loved, even if it meant sacrificing the son she had lost. The journey was not about a child who had been taken. It was about a man who had been stolen, and a woman who was about to risk everything to get him back. The small boat, tossed by the raging waves, was a fragile vessel on a sea of chaos. Sarah rowed with a frantic, desperate strength she didn't know she possessed. The boy in the bow a silent, unnerving compass. The storm was no ordinary tempest. It was a living, breathing entity, a physical manifestation of the water spirit's fury. The lightning flashed, illuminating the jagged cliffs ahead, and she saw it, the cave, a dark, gaping maw at the base of the rock face, exactly as the boy had drawn it. As they drew closer, the sound of the ocean, a low, guttural roar, seemed to emanate from within the cave itself. It was the sound of a living thing, a hungry thing. They abandoned the boat at the mouth of the cave and scrambled onto the slick, moss-covered rocks. The air inside was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth, decay, and a faint metallic scent she could not place. The boy led her deeper into the darkness, his small hand guiding her. Sarah's flashlight beam cut a narrow path through the oppressive blackness, revealing walls covered in strange, glistening moss that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. She saw shapes in the shadows, things that writhed and twisted, just like the drawings her son used to make. They were tentacles, appendages of some unseen horror, reaching out from the deep water that filled the center of the cave. And there, in the middle of the cavern, was the source of it all. Not the water spirit itself, but a single pulsing point of light that seemed to draw all the darkness to it. It was the heart of the curse, the source of the debt. And within its murky depths, she saw him, Robert. He was suspended in the water, his body still, his eyes closed, his face a mask of serene, unnatural peace. He was not breathing, but he was not dead. He was a prisoner, a soul trapped in a watery grave. A terrible, heart-wrenching sob tore from Sarah's throat. She had found him. She had come all this way, faced down her deepest fears, and she had found him. But the impostor, the part of her husband that lived within her son, was now in a state of frantic agony. He pointed to the pulsing light, and then to himself. He gestured for her to pull her husband out, to save him, to fulfill his side of the bargain. But Sarah looked at her son, at the boy who was both here and not here, and she felt a terrible choice pressing down on her. If she pulled her husband out, the spirit would be forced to return to its original form, to its true self. But what would happen to her son? Would he be left a hollow shell? A life without a soul? The decision was not hers to make. As she reached for her husband, the impostor pushed her back, his small face contorted with a terrible, silent plea. He then took a step, and then another, into the water. As he waded into the depths, the water began to churn violently. Strange, shadowy shapes began to form around him, tendrils of darkness that wrapped around his small body. He looked back at her. For a brief, fleeting moment, his eyes were no longer hollow. They were filled with the familiar warmth of her husband's gaze, a final, loving goodbye. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The pulsing light in the center of the cave began to recede, fading into nothingness. The water spirit had taken its payment, and the impostor, the piece of her husband's soul, had fulfilled his promise. As she pulled her husband from the water, his body was cold and limp, but he was alive. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her, and for a moment, the madness in his gaze was gone. But it was not a victory. She had saved one man, but she had lost two. The spirit had been appeased, but the cost was a terrible one. The water had returned her husband, but it had taken her son. and it had left her with a lifelong burden of grief. The curse was not broken, it had simply been passed on. A never-ending cycle of death and resurrection, of lives and souls. The sea, a thing of terrible beauty and merciless cruelty, had returned her husband, but it had not given him back. Robert was alive, his body miraculously unharmed, but his mind was a shattered mosaic of scattered memories and jumbled thoughts. He spoke in a soft, rambling cadence, his eyes fixed on a distant, unseen point. He would speak of the ocean, of its cold, endless depths, but he never mentioned the storm, the cave, or the debt. He was a man without a past, a body without a soul. Sarah, in her terrible, heartbreaking victory, had saved him from a watery grave, only to see him trapped in a prison of his own mind. He was a new kind of debtor, a living testament to the terrible price of the water spirit's bargain. Her son, the boy she had feared and fought, was once again whole. The moment the impostor had disappeared, a warmth had returned to his body, a light had returned to his eyes. He was the same boy who had fallen into the river, a child of innocence and joy. He had no memory of the terrifying days that had passed, of the silent, frightening presence that had inhabited him. He would run and play on the beach, his laughter echoing in the sea air, a sound that was both a balm and a torture to Sarah's heart. He was a reminder of what she had won and what she had lost. She would watch him from a distance, her heart a fragile, aching thing in her chest. She had her son back, but at what cost? The townspeople of Salty Cove watched them with a mix of awe and suspicion. They saw a woman who had gone into the sea's dark heart and returned with her husband, a man who was now a silent, broken shell. They saw a boy who had been changed by the river, and then, just as suddenly, was back to his old self. They whispered of madness, of deals made with the devil, of a family cursed by the sea. They would never know the truth. The terrible, impossible truth that Sarah carried with her every day. She had seen the real monster, a creature of light and darkness, of life and death. She had seen the man she loved sacrifice his soul, and the boy she loved become a host. Sarah remained in Salty Cove, her life a quiet, somber tribute to the men she had lost. She would walk with her husband every day, his hand in hers, his eyes gazing at the sea, and she would wonder if he saw the same ghosts she did. She would watch her son play on the beach, his innocent laughter, a testament to a truth he would never know. The family's legacy was no longer about wealth or status. It was about a terrible, unending cycle of debt. She was a mother, a wife, a survivor. But she was also a keeper of secrets, a woman who had stared into the heart of a great, terrible mystery and had returned with a broken heart and a lifelong burden. The sea had given her a life, but it had taken her soul. And every time she looked at the ocean, she would remember the cruel, impossible choice she had been forced to make, and the price she would have to pay forever. The story of Salty Cove, it seemed, was not one of heroes or villains, but of a woman who had tried to love and had been broken by a love that was too strong to be contained.